The wind howled outside the small white house on Maple Street, rattling the old shutters and whistling through the cracks in the window panes. Inside, an elderly woman named Margaret Evans sat in her armchair, staring at the quiet world beyond the glass. Her tea had gone cold, her hands trembled as she held the cup, and her eyes lingered on the empty chair across from her, the one that hadn't been filled since her husband, Henry, passed away 5 years earlier. The clock ticked louder than usual, as if reminding her that the days were long and the silence longer. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the small moments that can change a life, please take a second to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel. Because today's story will remind you that even a single act of warmth can echo across years. Every morning, Margaret would watch the neighborhood children walk to school. Their laughter carried down the street like sunlight she couldn't quite touch. Her house was always clean, her garden always trimmed, and yet her heart felt unbearably empty. She had no children of her own, and most days were filled with nothing but the hum of the old refrigerator and the creak of the rocking chair that once held so much joy. One cold November afternoon, as the gray sky threatened rain, she saw a small boy trudging past her house. His backpack was torn at the corner, and his coat looked too thin for the chill. He paused at the gate, looking uncertainly toward her porch, then continued walking. Something in the boy's hesitant glance tugged at her chest. Impulsively, she called out through the open window, her voice cracking but warm, "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea, dear?" The boy stopped, startled. His name was Ethan Parker, a shy 9-year-old who lived a few blocks away with his single mother, who often worked late shifts at the diner. He hesitated, unsure if he should trust a stranger, but the kindness in Margaret's voice melted his fear. Moments later, he was sitting at her kitchen table, his small hands wrapped around a steaming cup of cocoa while she served freshly baked cookies. As the rain began to fall, Margaret and Ethan talked about school, his favorite books, and how he liked to draw superheroes. He made her laugh for the first time in months, and she told him stories about her childhood in the countryside, stories filled with warmth and laughter that seemed to chase away the cold creeping through her house. Before he left that evening, she packed some cookies for him to take home. "Come by any time, Ethan," she said softly. "It gets lonely here sometimes." And he did. Every Friday after school, Ethan would stop by for tea, though it often turned into cocoa, cookies, or grilled cheese sandwiches. The boy began to brighten her days, and in return, she became like the grandmother he never had. They planted flowers in the spring, made snow angels in the winter, and spent countless afternoons talking about dreams and the stars. But time has a way of changing everything. As Ethan grew older, his visits became less frequent. High school, friends, and responsibilities filled his life. Margaret never blamed him. She knew life had its way of pulling people forward, but she missed him terribly. She still kept his favorite cup in the cupboard and sometimes left an extra plate on the table, out of habit, whispering to herself that maybe next Friday he'd come by again. Years passed. Her hair turned completely silver, her steps slower. The garden began to overgrow, and the house that once echoed with laughter returned to its quiet stillness. One snowy morning, the mailman found her struggling to clear her front steps. The neighbors checked on her occasionally, but the world seemed to move faster than she could keep up with. Her heart, though gentle, carried the weight of time. One chilly December evening, Margaret sat alone by the fireplace, clutching an old photograph. Ethan at 10, grinning with a cookie in one hand, and her beside him, laughing. She whispered to the empty room, "I hope he's doing well." She never expected to see him again, but fate had its own plans. That Christmas Eve, as snow blanketed the street in silence, a car pulled up in front of her home. The headlights cut through the storm, and a tall young man stepped out, brushing snow from his coat. He hesitated at the gate just like he had all those years ago, then walked slowly up the path. Margaret heard the knock, firm but familiar, and her frail heart skipped. When she opened the door, she froze. There stood Ethan, no longer the shy boy she once knew, but a grown man in his 20s, his eyes filled with warmth and emotion. "Hi, Mrs. Evans," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I hope I'm not too late for tea." Her eyes flooded with tears as she reached out, her hands shaking. "Oh, my dear boy," was all she could manage before he stepped forward and hugged her. a long, heartfelt embrace that bridged the years between them. Inside, the room seemed brighter. Ethan looked around, smiling at the familiar furniture, the same old tea set still waiting on the shelf. They sat by the fire, and she poured tea, her hands trembling as she poured his cup. The same blue one with a chip on the rim. "I kept it for you," she whispered. He smiled and reached into his coat pocket. "I brought you something," he said, placing a small wrapped box in her lap. She carefully untied the ribbon, her eyes widening as she lifted the lid. Inside was a golden locket, delicate and simple, engraved with a small picture, the photo of the two of them from years ago. On the back were the words, "You made me believe in kindness." Margaret's tears spilled freely as she traced the engraving with trembling fingers. "Oh, Ethan, it's beautiful," she whispered. He took her hand gently. "You don't know what you did for me," he said. "When I was a kid, my mom worked so much. I felt alone most of the time, but coming here, having someone who cared, someone who listened, it changed me. You were my family when I didn't have one." For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled and the snow fell outside, painting the world in peace. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, not just happiness, but purpose. She realized that love, no matter how small or simple, never truly fades. It just waits for the right moment to return. That night, as Ethan helped her decorate a tiny Christmas tree, they laughed like they once did, bridging time and memory. Before he left, he promised to visit every week, not out of pity, but out of love. And he kept that promise. The neighbors began to notice the change in the little white house on Maple Street. Flowers bloomed again in the garden, and laughter once more drifted through the open windows. Margaret's final years were not lonely ones. They were filled with warmth, friendship, and the sound of a boy's heart that had never forgotten her kindness. When she passed peacefully, a few years later, Ethan stood by her grave, holding the same locket she had worn until her last day. He smiled through tears and whispered, "Thank you for inviting me in, Grandma. You gave me a home when I needed it most." If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe, because the world needs more reminders that kindness never expires, and love always finds its way back. Before you go, tell us in the comments, have you ever met someone whose small act of kindness changed your life forever? A touching story of love, memory, and the lasting power of compassion, reminding us all that even one simple invitation can change two lives forever.